This is my review and field test of several zoom and one telephoto prime lens. Now, I recently returned from a trip with the McKay Photography Academy. I was one of the instructors, and the trip was really split into two sections. First couple of days we got to work with some animals at amazingly close distances. Actually, it was sometimes a little silly to have some of these really long lenses in those cases, but it was an excellent test bed for shooting, especially some of the faster moving subjects like the wolves and the jumping cougars, for these zoom lenses. Now, technically, this is a review of zooms and one prime lens as well. And we're going to get into that list right now of what I was using out there. I took several thousand pictures over the course of the last week, both the animals and scenery, with a variety of these lenses. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the Tamron 150 to 600. We're going to go into more detail about all of these lenses in just a second, but let me give you the full list right now. The Sigma 150 to 600, a massive lens, which happens to be sitting right here. The Canon 100 to 400, the Mark II, that's the newer one. The Canon 400mm prime lens, so there's your prime that is not technically a zoom, or it's not a zoom, but it is a telephoto lens. And also, just a little bit of an odd matchup in this mix, but I wanted to throw it in just to give people an idea. When I mentioned that I was going to be shooting with the 70 to 200 and the 2x extender as well, I had a lot of interest. There is a fair number of folks out there that have picked up this lens and are oftentimes looking for greater zoom. The extender is a cheap way to add that in if you already have this, but we're going to match it up to the rest as well. The bodies that I use that I was shooting with are both the 5D Mark III and the 7D Mark II. I'm not going to go into detail about body usage on these, but of course one is a crop sensor, one is a full frame sensor, so that gave me an idea of how these performed on these different bodies. And generally, the good news is, one, if you're watching this review after you've bought one of these things, you've got a good lens. All of these lenses are quite impressive. We're going to go through kind of the feature list of all of them and then chart it up a little bit and talk about my findings and a value, a verdict, and versatility. So let's get started. So the first, the Tamron 150 to 600. It's an f5 to 6.3 lens, full frame sensor or crop sensor. It's happy on both of those. Of course, it is a more narrow field of view when you're putting it on a crop factor lens. You get a multiply 1.6, Canon 1.5. And I'll mention that for both the Tamron and the Sigma. If you're not doing wildlife, if you want a more versatile lens, starting at 150 with a crop sensor, that's a lot of zoom, and sometimes it may be too much zoom. As I mentioned, working with some of these animals at amazingly close distances because they were not all wild animals, it was a little too close at times. But the Tamron comes in at $1,069, which is the cheapest out of everything we're talking about except for the 2x extender, which of course can't just be used by itself. That's a great price. It's 4.5 pounds or 4.3 pounds if we want to get technical. It's got a 95mm filter size, very large, but not ridiculously large like the Sigma that we'll talk about in a second. Downside in red here I've got listed not fully weather sealed. Tamron does claim some moisture resistance, but as far as fully weather sealed like a Canon or like the Sigma, it's not at that level. 4.3 pounds has some heft to it, but it is certainly hand holdable without too much of a struggle. Here's an example shot with the 7D Mark II and the Tamron 150 to 600 at 600. I'm going to put a link down below to the full size resolution of these images so you can get an idea. But I did not shoot carefully chest charts and things like that in this review. I really just went out and used these lenses. There were a couple times where I made some careful comparisons between one or the other, but I'm confident in my recommendations in saying that the Tamron, for the money, is a very sharp lens. But let's move on and talk a little bit about the Sigma now. As you can see, it's sitting here. It is a massive lens. Comes in at $1,999. Now, some of these prices listed are a little cheaper right now with rebates, mostly the Canons that I'm talking about, the Sigma. Very new, $1,999. 6.3 pounds. You feel that. And if you are trying to hand-hold shoot with this, It's not the easiest lens to hold. Think about putting it on a 5D Mark III, you're adding another pound or so, and very quickly you have a heavy beast. As you start to zoom this lens, the balance is not great. So that is certainly a downside. If you're in a situation where you can use a monopod or a tripod, then absolutely this becomes much more usable. But if you're thinking about heading out into the woods, one, you're carrying around a huge lens that is very massive, really nice high quality build though, with a built-in lens, or not built-in lens hood, but really nice lens hood. It's heavy. You've got to keep that in mind. It also has a massive 105mm filter. You're less likely to want to use filters on super zoom type lenses or really long telephoto lenses, but if you did, you're going to be spending a lot to get that much glass filter on the end of this. It is fully weather sealed, and it's also really nicely customizable with custom modes here. Now all of that's accessed through the USB dock that Sigma sells for just a little bit more money. You plug it in, and you can very nicely set up custom modes. Focusing speed is just part of that. You can also really use that USB dock to dial in your autofocus adjustments and make sure that this lens is super sharp on whatever body that you're using. It's also got two modes. You've got your two modes of OS, your standard and your panning. It's got focus limiting ranges as well and a variety of focus modes. It is full-time autofocus, but you can move it over to always manual. Build quality, I mentioned top notch, just feels really good in the hand except for that weight. One other nice thing is that it has a lock here. All of these lenses creep when you are hanging down. They all drift down unless you use the lock. It's got a hard lock at 150 and 600, but it also has soft locks at all of the lens marking spots. So if you find yourself often shooting it at a distance, you can soft lock it in there and it will stay until you snap it by grabbing and rotating or reversing on the ring. Very large, hefty tripod collar. 3 points for you to attach to a tripod or monopod, which depending on the body you have attached to it gives you a better balance point. That works really good. The main downside you see here is that it just is massive and heavy. That's a downside. Sharpness wise, I found it to be maybe a tiny bit better than the Tamron 150 to 600, but not enough that I would set out into the woods with this lens over the Tamron. The weight savings on the Tamron, the price savings on the Tamron, for the most part, I would pick the Tamron between those two. Now, here's a shot with the 5D Mark III with the Sigma 150 to 600 at 548. This happens to be one of my more favorite pictures. 100% view of this, and you can see the individual hairs right around this bobcat's mouth with the little bits of snow in it, and it is a fantastically sharp lens. And as I said, sharper than the Tamron in most cases, but not a huge significant difference in real-world shooting. Let's talk now about the 100 to 400 from Canon. I often like to spoil my reviews, but I'm going to make you wait to the very end to hear my full thoughts. But this lens is really nice. You're giving up some zoom. Well, let's go through the bullet list first. $21.99. So it is the most expensive of the bunch unless you are adding up the price of the extender and the 2X. 3.5 pounds, lighter than the others we've seen so far. 77mm filter size, so a decent filter size that matches up with many other telephoto lenses like 70-200 as well. Fully weather sealed. It's got a nice plastic hood, so a little bit lighter, keeps the weight down. I mean, this right here weighs as much as the 10 to 18 Canon lens. It's got a little door in it for adjusting circular polarizers or other filters that need adjustments as well. It also is customizable in that you have this tension ring right here that you can adjust how smooth or tight you want the focus to be. All of these lenses do extend, none of them are internally focusing. And that's nice. You also have 3 panning modes. 1, your normal, 2, your active, and 3, only when you're pressing down on the shutter button to actually take the picture will it stabilize. And of course you have focusing limiters, just 2 here in this case. On the Sigma you have 3 ranges of focus limiters. And of course it is full-time manual focus as well, with a nice tripod collar with just 1 point here as well. But you can see the difference in size between these two is fairly significant, the difference in weight, and I really found myself going back to this lens most of the time simply because it's a joy to hand hold and shoot with. It just feels really nice. It's actually just a little bit smaller than the 70-200. As far as length goes, very similar. It's a little bit more, a little wider. I just really enjoy it. Yes, you give up some zoom over the Sigma and over the Tamron, but for pure joy of use and fit in your bag and go with you, it works out really, really nicely. The downside, of course, is it's expensive. It is the most expensive of the group. You're partly paying for the Canon name on there, and you're partly paying for the sharpness. One thing I didn't put on this list that we need to talk about, though, is focusing speed and accuracy. The Canon 100-400, there was a couple reasons I kept going back to it. One was that it was a joy to use, and part of that joy came from how amazingly fast it got things in focus. Now, to be fair, it has a little bit less of a range to think about than the Tamron or the Sigma or the Tamron, but it focuses so fast that most of the time I wouldn't notice it focusing. It just would be in focus. It really, and we're talking about fast-moving creatures. I think one of the examples here I have is this little pine marten that jumped up out of the snow. Oftentimes, you had just a second or two to get into shot before it would go back down. Also, shooting wolves running towards you. There was a protective barrier in between me and the wolves, so I didn't have to worry about that. But very quickly, one of the most difficult directions, moving straight towards you and shooting with both the 5D Mark II and the 7D Mark II, sorry, 5D Mark III and the 7D Mark II, it would easily, in AI servo, keep them in focus as it was moving. Really, really nice overall lens. Very much an enjoyable feature to use. Now, I also shot with, not a ton, but some, the 400mm f5.6L lens. 1339. This was probably technically the sharpest out of all of them. Now, I'm a huge proponent of prime lenses. If you've watched some of my other reviews, I think prime lenses are fantastic because with fewer moving parts, you can often get a sharper, lighter body that works really well and also gives you great aperture control. This is one of the wider apertures available to you at 400mm and f5.6. Everything else is just a little bit higher except for this guy right here. So the downside though, when you're using a telephoto prime, well, let's back up. When you're using a prime lens, you zoom with your feet. You move a little bit to get the shot or the framing or the composition that you want. When you are shooting with such a long prime lens, sometimes you have to move a good bit to get the composition you want. So you really have to think about what you're shooting and how much freedom and time you're going to have to compose your shot. I don't want to be too hard on this, but it does make it very tricky to use and way less versatile than these other lenses at times. The upside though is it is really light. 2.7 pounds, very easy to hand hold. It's got an integrated hood. Filter size is 77mm as well, so we're in that nice normal range. It is not completely weather sealed. The switches are, but it doesn't have a body seal. That integrated hood is really nice though. It just slides right out and tightens by a quick twist. So that's nice that it's all integrated there. You're never going to leave that home. It adds a little bit of protection. The big downside though, besides the partially weather sealing, is that there is no image stabilization. That also limits the versatility of this lens. In lower light situations, you're going to find yourself struggling or really raising your ISO to high levels. And that can be frustrating in some circumstances, especially for some wildlife circumstances where a lot of the wildlife and a lot of the good light is early in the morning or in the evenings. But at $13.39, also a little bit cheaper with rebates right now, and at 2.7 pounds, it is a very nice option. And repeating myself here, but I want to make sure you hear this. It is the sharpest of the bunch. Now, this is an example shot. This bear was incredibly backlit situation. And again, I'm going to put up full resolution images linked right down below. You can zoom in, no chromatic aberration, just a fantastically sharp shot with this. But as I said, this again was not a wild bear. We could move around some, but it was very tricky to get the shot I wanted without a ton of moving with a prime lens like the 400. Last thing I want to talk about is the 70-200 and the 2x extender. Now I have another review where I talk in detail about the 2x extender, so let's just go down through the list real quick. Talk about prices. $21.99 for the 70-200 f2.8. It is a fantastic lens. We use this at our weddings. It is on my camera for huge portions of the weddings. It allows me to get beautiful shots with great contrast in low light or bright light, and it's just a really nice lens to use. It's hefty though. When you throw the 2x extender on, which costs $449, you basically cut your light in half, 2 stops of light. That's a huge minus. So an f2.8 lens becomes an f5.6 lens. That's still decent across that range, a fixed, so at 400, you're still at f5.6. That's the same in that prime situation. But the weight is about 3.9 pounds, so let's say 4 pounds, so it's getting hefty. The balance is not great when you're connecting these two things together. And your focus certainly takes a hit. I saw way more hunting for focus with this combination in mind. Now keep in mind the 70-200 by itself focuses very fast, very confident. But when you throw that extender on and you cut that much light, I do find it to be the focus to be noticeably slower. And there was hunting at times that I did not see with the other lenses when I was using those. And when some lenses, so you don't have to pair that 2x extender with a 70-200. There are some other lenses, and as I said in my full review, you can watch, I talk about that. But some lenses won't autofocus at all if you've gone above f8. f8 is typically the maximum aperture that some lenses will focus with, or I should say minimum, and that creates an issue. Now, it's pretty neat. You can use the 2x extender with the 150-600. I took a moonshot of the other day, but it is manual focus only. With the 100-400 as well, it is manual focus only. And of course, with the 150-600, with the 2x extender, your maximum available aperture to you is f13, because when you're shooting out at 600, you're at f6.3. You double that, and you're at f13. So you're cutting an immense amount of light. But if you already have a 70-200 and you're not constantly shooting wildlife, you just want a little bit more range, the 2x extender is a viable option. At only $450, it only adds a little bit of weight. You continue to be able to use your image stabilization and autofocus if you're below that f8 or the f8. All right, now let's talk. Well, we got an example of the 5D Mark III with the 70-200 and 2x extender. This has been cropped slightly, and sharpness-wise, it's good. I posted this on Instagram a few weeks ago, or a few days ago. Basically said I have got some other shots using the 2x extender, including the 100-400, and some of those are manual focus, and the 150-600. And the moral of the story when using a 2x extender is if you're starting with a good quality lens, the results are often very good. The quality, the sharpness, the contrast does not take as much of a hit as your aperture does and your focus. So you're not losing 2x the quality, just losing a lot of that light. Now, here's our little chart. It's got all of the information on there. The big downside to the Canon 400, of course, the prime, is no image stabilization, and also being a prime lens, it's a little less versatile. I think the extra bonuses for the Sigma are a good value. That very customizable, very adjustable, plug it into the USB dock and you can do those things. The 100-400 doesn't have that USB dock, but you do have the dial here, and you do have the 3 different stabilizer modes there as well. The Canon 400 jumping around now has the integrated hood as well. But let me give you the verdict on value first. The Tamron 150-600 at $1,069, it's getting big, it's getting hefty, but its weight is still significant less than the 100-500, 150 to 600. You make some sacrifices there. But for 1069 and sharpness and quality that are on par with these other lenses, maybe a little bit below, it's a fantastic lens, and I'd be happy to walk out into the woods using that lens at that price point. You go read the reviews, and pretty much everyone says, for the money, this is an awesome lens. I agree. You also have to throw the Canon Prime on here though, because that is the sharpest of the bunch, and you are making sacrifices that you often make with primes. I feel like they're a little bit more difficult sacrifices with such a long prime, but again, for the money, it's very lightweight, very portable, and gives you excellent quality if you can deal with not having that image stabilization. Versatility, the Canon 100 to 400. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning, using this on both full frame and crop. 150 on a crop can be too close at times. 100, starting at 100 on a crop, gives you about 160 or 150 depending on Nikon or Canon. Although Nikon, you're not going to be shooting with this because it's a Canon lens. It's much more doable and versatile. And yes, you're giving up some of that zoom on the Tamron or Sigma, but as I said, you are gaining incredibly fast focusing. Never saw this hunt. You're gaining a much more portable lens, and it's sharp enough that you can crop in some and be close to that 600 range without worrying about losing too much quality. Good? Now, verdict. Well, as I said, I often say, there is none of these are the best clear winner. If you have a situation where you can use a monopod or a tripod often and you want 600 millimeters, the Sigma is fantastic. Great lens. If you're going to be hand holding much more often, you want to be able to travel, some portability, the 100 to 400 from Canon is what I would suggest. If budget is a concern, and you don't mind that extra large size of the Tamron, larger size than the Canon, it is a fine lens. As I said at the beginning, all of these lenses are good, and I didn't see huge differences in real-world testing in the sharpness, contrast, or quality between these lenses. If you've already got the 70 to 200 and you just want a little more zoom sometimes, the 2x extender certainly works, and that prime that I already mentioned under the value as well. So these are my thoughts on these lenses. If you've got any questions about them, leave a comment right down below. I'd be happy to answer those. But remember to give me a thumbs up if this review and this real-world testing was helpful. I also would appreciate that you subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Take a moment to click that button so that you are updated with future reviews, real-world testing, and tips, and our weekly podcast. Also, I have a Patreon campaign running where you can help support. Making reviews like this is partially helped from places like B&H, but it's also partially funded by my own money. And I need your support to continue to make reviews like this. So take a moment. There are perks for supporters. I'd appreciate it if you clicked on over there, take a look, and supported me at any level available to you. And as I mentioned, partially funded, partially supported by B&H, loaning me gear to review. I would appreciate you using their links to purchase. I also earn a small percentage from that. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.